The islands of Palau. Palau, usually considered part of the Caroline Islands and sitting far west in the group, is a small group of about 100 islands. From south to north, the main islands are Anguar, Peleliu, Gemelis, Ilmak, Negertabo, Koror, which holds the capital city of Koror, Negrebizang, Babelthorpe, the largest island in the Palau chain, Cormoran Reef, Caso Reef, Kayangal, Garanuel Reef. Palau is about 1,000 miles southwest of Manila, Philippines, and also about 1,000 miles southwest of Saipan and the Marianas. At the northern end of Babelthorpe is Caso Passage, a strait between Babelthorpe and Caso Reef. We were to be based there off land. The islands of Peleliu and Anguar at the southern end of Palau were secured by the end of September 1944 by U.S. Army and Marine troops after a very bloody invasion. Several military historians questioned the Palau invasion, writing a number of articles about its value. In the Reader's Digest Association Limited's The World at Arms, under the headline Palau's A Pointless Sacrifice, it was noted the Americans lost nearly 2,000 men taking the islands in a bloody confrontation as bitter as that on Tarawa 10 months earlier. It was not at all as planned and arguably not even necessary. The Japanese lost 13,600 men, 10,500 alone on Peleliu. Again, only a few prisoners were taken, some 400, mostly Koreans and Okinawans. Caso Passage. The move from Parry Island beginning on October 16th was completed by the 26th and took the squadron deep into the advanced area. Upon arrival at Caso, all personnel were billeted aboard two seaplane tenders, the USS Chandeleur, AV-10, and the USS Mackinac, AVP-13. The Chandeleur was a Pacific veteran, having been active in a number of campaigns since December of 1942. She was anchored 8 miles north of Babelthorpe Island, where about 4,000 to 10,000 bypassed Japanese troops were, depending on who was talked to. Caso Passage was a suitable ship anchorage, but was open to the ocean at both ends, and the resulting sea swells made seaplane operation most difficult. Under certain wind conditions, landings and takeoffs were equivalent to operating in the open sea. Lots of Japanese. Compounding the squadron's operations were the aforementioned isolated troops from Babelthorpe, who were a constant threat to planes in the passage. This threat made it difficult for our aircraft crews because now all 15 planes had to be manned at all times, with a buoy watch of one officer and 4 enlisted men. These buoy watches were important not only for weather problems that might arise, but also because of the constant threat of the armed enemy. We set up these watches from sundown on a 2 to 3 hour basis, depending on when we hit the sack. This watch setup assured that someone was always alert and armed with a submachine gun or carbine on the wing or in the cockpit throughout the night. There was a PT boat squadron based nearby, and they were helpful as patrolling the passage after dark. They also would play a critical role concerning 2 of our crews in early November. Seaplane tenders. Although not officially listed as combatant ships, seaplane tenders are often the first ships in an invasion fleet to operate at the point of attack before a given D-Day. Prime examples were the tenders at Saipan, Okinawa. They arrived several days before actual D-Day hostilities began. AVs were the largest of the seaplane tenders. They housed all kinds of repair facilities and had the ability to bring a plane on deck for major repairs. The AVs were of 2 classes, one that included the USS Curtis, with 2 seaplane cranes on the seaplane deck and designed to handle up to 2 full squadrons. The other class included the USS Chandeleur and 5 sister ships. They were equipped with 1 seaplane crane and the necessary repair shops and quarters for 1 squadron's flight and ground crews. At about 8,500 tons and approximately 492 feet in length, tenders were masterpieces of engineering, having every conceivable repair facility. The maintenance people often said they could build a plane if they had to, and I think they could have. On the aft deck, the seaplane deck, the big PBMs would be hoisted aboard when major repairs like an engine change were required. The tenders provided living quarters at all support functions and performed all major repairs, but routine maintenance and servicing of the planes was carried out at the buoy as there were no shore facilities available. This was performed with the able assistance of the PATSUs, P-A-T-S-U-S, Patrol Aircraft Service Units, based on board the tenders. Maintenance performed at the buoy was never easy. Working from either side of the engine nacelle, the trick was to hold on while handling all the nuts and bolts on aluminum stands when the water was rough. It was quite an art. The maintenance chief used to say to the mechanics, "If I hear one splash, I better hear two." The message being, don't lose a tool. The other occupational hazard was that any commotion in the water might draw some sharks. The small tenders, AVPs like the Mackinac and the Casco, had PATSU detachments, machine shops, and could do emergency repairs, but could not bring a plane aboard. Seaplane tenders like seaplanes in World War II are not high profile, but they made rather remote combat theater operations possible by providing a complete independent mobile home for seaplanes hundreds to thousands of miles from shore bases. So the two tenders, the Chandeleur and the Mackinac, were home for us. They provided all of our needs, from spare parts for the planes to food, haircuts, movies, gee-dunk stand, and a ship service for 5-cent-a-pack cigarettes, toothpaste, and other sundries. Later on, this entire squadron would be housed on the Chandeleur, but for this period we were split between the two tenders. It caused no major problems other than some inconvenience for interdepartmental operations. However, morale improved a bit once we were all housed together. In all the time I've been in the Navy, I'd spent little time aboard ship. Life on ship is different. Almost everything on a ship is metal because of the ever-present danger of fire. Everything is painted gray. And there's an old Navy saying, if it moves, salute it. If it doesn't move, paint it. Painting and repainting and chipping paint was a constant for the deck crew. We had to dye our hats blue and wear dark socks for low visibility. When leaving or boarding a ship, you saluted the officer of the deck and the fantail where the flag flew. All ships are highly compartmentalized with innumerable hatches and doors, which can be shut and dogged down during general quarters. Ladders, stairs, were usually double sets. You went down on the port side, the left, and up on the starboard side, the right, to allow rapid movement in emergencies. God forbid if you used the wrong side. So everything on board ship was very orderly, and there is a routine for everything. All activities are done on a regular schedule, and each activity was announced endlessly. One of the annoyances of shipboard life was the constant bosun's whistle and orders over the loudspeaker system like, "Now hear this, the smoking lamp is lit. A division will muster on the fantail. Protestant services are being held in the enlisted mess. Sweepers, man your brooms. General quarters, man your battle stations." One of the real joys of life on the tender was being able to shower. I had friends in the Army and Marines who talked about not getting a real bath or shower for weeks at a time. Showering was a real luxury for us in the constant heat and humidity. Although bathing hours were limited and water was carefully conserved, it was a real treat because we were all pretty ripe most of the time. It was often over 100 degrees below decks. There were no real sleeping areas assigned, as I recall. We often slept on cots requisitioned each evening, and we shared bunks with other crews in the link trainer room. We at one point did have some bunks in one of the lower compartments made available. These, as I recall, were in tiers 6 high. Sleeping in one of those, except for the top one, was known as horizontal sleeping because one had no room vertically to turn over. I always managed to get the top one, and then would hook a pair of my dungarees over the blower that brought fresh air into the compartment and set it so that it blew directly on me. Primitive air conditioning. At one point or another, we all suffered from the brutal heat rash and would be painted in a sick bay with a purple ointment. Because it was always so hot, at each scuttlebutt, water fountains, There were salt pill dispensers, and it was recommended that we swallow a couple once or twice a day. We always ate early or late because meals had to coincide with our watch and flight schedules. I will always remember chow and the chandelure. It varied as a generalization, but it was not gourmet. Breakfast was memorable, with beans twice a week. Actually not too bad with enough ketchup. Then there was the raisin bread served periodically. I inquired of one of the cooks why it was such a periodic item on the menu, and he responded with a straight face, "We make it towards the end of our flour ration. And when the flour weevils become more apparent, then we throw in a few raisins with the dough because they're the same color." The cooks and bakers did their best, and we all survived in spite of all the griping. Patrols began. We relieved Squadron VPB-202, the first PBM squadron deployed to the Pacific, and immediately began flying a daily average of 4.5 patrols a day in 10-degree, 600-mile sectors. Initially, there were 3 other squadrons operating with us out of Kassel: VPB-17, VPB-16, and VPB-216. We were flying advanced patrols out as far as Samar Island in the Philippines. These patrols were in support of one of the greatest sea battles in history, the Battle for Leyte Gulf, which is between Samar and Leyte Island, Philippines, and the subsequent landings of the U.S. Army troops on Leyte. This battle was the beginning of the end for the Japanese Navy. They lost 26 ships, including the huge battleship Musashi, while the United States lost 6 ships. This was the first time the squadron found themselves shepherding major portions of the Pacific Fleet, with the constant threat of enemy submarines in the area. One of the first patrols out of Kassel was flown by Crew 5, and several of the crew commented, "Taking off was a real experience. We might as well have been operating in the open sea." We didn't realize that we hadn't seen anything yet. In late October, the duty crews arose one morning to see torpedoes being loaded on their planes. A strong Japanese task force had sailed down to the Philippines to bombard MacArthur's invading U.S. troops. Admiral Halsey and the Third Fleet were on a raid somewhere north of the Philippines, and so were unavailable. The plan was for the PBMs to go after the Japanese, as MacArthur's force, trying to invade by land, had been left with no real air cover. We were pleasantly disappointed, however. Unexplained to this day, the Japanese turned and left after an encounter with several U.S. escort aircraft carriers. It made for a more pleasant day for the duty crews as the torpedoes were removed from the planes. Another crash at sea. Actually, things ran rather smoothly for the squadron until October 27th, when Crew 4, flying at the sector closely paralleling the east coast of Luzon Island, Philippines, had a real problem. They had completed their outbound leg and their cross leg. Then about midday, as they were making its starboard turn to commence the inbound leg of their patrol, the crew spotted a 2-man life raft. The raft held an SB-2C dive bomber crew from the aircraft carrier USS Hancock. They had crashed 3 days earlier as a result of battle damage. This incident was just subsequent to the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea. The details of the ordeal are unfolded and best portrayed in a letter from Ken Iman, first pilot, who later wrote to his parents. "Dear Mother and Dad, it's at least 2 weeks since I've written, and yet it seems like several months at best. In the interim between my last letter and this, adventures have happened to me which shouldn't happen to a dog, and as far as that goes, probably wouldn't. The title of the story I'm about to relate could be called 16 Men on a 7-Man Raft, aided and abetted by Adolf the Shark, or by short title, Thank God for the Goodyear Rubber Company. It all started out like this. We were out on routine patrol, and about 2 in the afternoon spotted 2 survivors in a small rubber life raft. Knowing full well the hazards involved in an open sea landing and takeoff, we nonetheless decided to risk it for the chance to save the lives of the 2 people in the raft. So down we went. John Moriarty at the controls. John made the most beautiful landing in 10 to 15 foot swells that I shall ever hope to see, and we were on the water. We taxied over to the raft and picked up the two boys, who were exceedingly glad to see us, as you can imagine. They had already been in the water for 48 hours. They came aboard and we gave them some water. John and I then went forward to the flight deck and began to make preparations for takeoff. Only a minute or two later, one of the crew members came forward and announced that we were taking on a great deal of water in the after station, and that there was a fairly big hole in the hull. Evidently we had hit a float lighter or a log or a box in the water or something when we landed. Realizing we must take off immediately or sink right there, we decided to gamble on a takeoff. By this time the water was 2 feet above the deck in the after station, as we found out later. So we quickly started the engines and away we went, hell-bent for election. The big plane thundered into the air. Just as we were airborne, all the water we had picked up rushed aft, resulting in progressive instability. This upset our balance badly and threw the nose up in the air. The plane stalled at about 100 feet and fell off on its right wing. Down we came. The right wing smacked the water and acted as a cushion and a pivot as it spun us around in a big water loop, splitting the big hole in the center section. A little less water or a little luck and it wouldn't have happened, but that would be another story. Well, there we were. Guys began swimming out of the plane like flies coming out of a bottle. They came out of hatches, holes in the sides, and Lord knows where. Not a man was injured outside of a few minor cuts and bruises, and I do mean minor. Nonetheless, old lucky me didn't even get a scratch. I unbuttoned my safety belt and climbed out on the wing. The only really perilous part of the adventure was right then, because we didn't have any life rafts out. So another fellow and I jumped off the wing and swam around to the waist hatch, which we forced open. I climbed inside, and the gas fumes were pretty bad. I managed to get out one of the life rafts, and then had to get out myself for fear of passing out from the gas fumes. Out in the water again, we inflated the raft and watched the plane sink about 1 minute later. We paddled around and picked up the rest of the boys. We were all set, come what may. I have never seen two people who were more dejected looking than our survivors. In and out and in again, all within 30 minutes. The rest of the boys were in a good mood, though, laughing and making jokes about our predicament. They thought all personnel had clambered aboard, but it was discovered that Sam Payon, an orographer's mate, had been aboard for weather observations, was missing. Suddenly they spotted Payon and his Mae West floating on his back about 100 yards from the raft. They retrieved Payon and tried for about 20 minutes to revive him via artificial respiration, but were unsuccessful. Through exposure to the aviation gas, he had lost most of his skin. He was pronounced dead at about 1700, and his body was committed to the deep with appropriate ceremony. There was only one catch. It was a 7-man raft, an affair about as big as the dining room table. In order to keep the darn thing afloat, or more precisely to keep the gunwales above water, 2 men had to hang on the side of the raft. It wasn't such a great strain because there were so many of us and we could take turns. At least it wasn't much of a strain until Adolf, a 6-foot shark, made his appearance. Well, anyway, about 5:30, Adolf surfaces from out of the deep about 5 feet from the raft. Everyone seemed to see him at the same time, and the natural reflex was to draw away from him, with the result that we almost capsized the raft. The Navy has a publication called Shark Sense, which tells all about sharks and which you all have read. It states emphatically that sharks probably won't bother you, and they can be driven away by threshing the water with a paddle. Everyone grabbed a paddle at the same time and began to beat the water like mad. Adolf, as he was promptly dubbed by one of the crewmen, didn't seem to be particularly frightened, but he did obligingly retreat about 10 feet, from which he eyed us wistfully. When I first saw him, I was sworn it was the biggest fish I'd ever seen, whales and all. Actually, Adolf's stature was about 6'2", 195 pounds soaking wet, with pearly white teeth. Night was upon us before we knew it, and there was a brilliant moon with actually, Adolf's stature was about 6 feet 2 inches, 195 pounds soaking wet, with pearly white teeth. Night was upon us before we knew it, and it was a brilliant moon-lit night with a full moon. There were about 10 of us without any cuts who could go over the side. We didn't dare let anyone go over who had been bleeding for fear that the smell of blood in the water would set the shark thinking. So the 10 of us divided into 5 groups of 2 and decided to take 15-minute stretches in the water. M.L. Brown, an ordnance, had said later, the water was so cold at night that 15 minutes is about the limit because you'd get chills. Believe me, I've never been called upon to muster as much courage as it took to go over the side when my turn came. The fellows were all magnificent when the time came and went over without a whimper. And that was something with Adolf licking his chops about 10 feet away. 4 men in the raft were detailed to continually beat the water with their paddles. This seemed to work for an hour or so, but Adolf grew bolder and bolder. A more effective remedy was devised, and this consisted of poking him in the nose with a paddle when he came too close. Once Adolf made a foray around the boat with his fin sticking out of the water. One of the boys hit him in the fin with an aluminum paddle so hard that it bent the paddle, and the blow seemed to arouse some measure of respect, for Adolf kept his distance for a few minutes. That damn shark was with us for 15 hours, but surprisingly enough, he didn't molest us once. I believe old Adolf was more curious than hungry, but we weren't about to rely on that supposition. 20 white toes on 4 feet dangling in the clear water looked like good shark bait to us. Well, to cut a long story into a character sketch, we were sighted by a plane the next morning, and the pilot dropped us a 2-man raft into which people promptly jumped. The added room allowed all of us to get back on the raft, which is a good thing because Adolf was joined by 2 buddies along about dawn. Without any further incidents, we were picked up by a ship which had been sent to pick us up. We boarded her about 5 p.m. after having been in the raft about 25 hours. All of us were in excellent health and spirits, and our 24 hours had been an unusual adventure for all of us, even Adolf. For those 24 hours, it was a big game, but the next 24 would have been uncomfortable because of our cramped quarters. The pilot who spotted us reported that the raft looked a bit overloaded, which may turn out to be one of the classic understatements of the war. Nonetheless, our general excellent physical condition left us with the impression that we could have gone on for a good many days had circumstances forced the issue. We had no food or water aboard, but did have some fish hooks and would probably have pulled Adolf aboard along about the 4th or 5th day. We received royal treatment aboard the ship, and for over a while now we have been doing nothing save sleeping and eating like gourmands. We went down on Navy Day, the 27th of October, and since this have been trying to get back to our base. I believe we will get there in another day or so. A few other things happened which I can't reveal for military reasons, but none of them were of serious nature. So that about ends the story, and there's little to add, except that we're all very well and are happy, and are getting fat from doing nothing for over a week. I will write again in a day or so, and my future letters will contain little more than my normal commentaries about nothing, so faithfully promising not to get mixed up in anything more exciting than a game of checkers, I close with all my love, Kay. I talked earlier in this narrative about heroes, and in this crash there were many, but 2 who stood out: Lieutenant Ken Iman, first pilot, and E.B. Gilliland, plane captain, who returned to the sinking plane to salvage a life raft. There were several other highlights of this disaster. At about 0900 on the morning following the crash, a plane was spotted heading right for the raft. The crew made an ineffectual attempt to ignite a smoke light to attract the plane's attention. They were fortunate, however, that it didn't light. When the plane came into full view, it turned out to be a Japanese fighter, which flew over at about 1,000 feet. There was complete silence and immobility on the raft as the plane continued on course. Shortly after that, they saw four more planes, which were identified as ours. These planes circled over them and dropped a raft, food, and water, and a note that said, "Howdy, fellas. We'll have you picked up soon." In a short time, a destroyer arrived and picked the group up. The rescue ship was the USS Cushing, DD-797. captained by Commander Louis F. Volk, who with the crew of the ship proved to be excellent hosts. The Cushing was part of a task force raiding the Philippines, and the survivors were treated to some shipboard combat, including a torpedo that was fired at the ship but missed. A few days later, they were transferred to the USS Sabine, a fleet oiler, and then to the USS Casco, an AVP, that brought them back to Castle Passage. Another twist to this incident, Crew 4's plane, Victor 4, was down for maintenance, and they were flying Victor 5. When the typhoon of November 6th to the 8th hit Castle Passage, Victor 4, manned by Crew 12, was sunk. On the plane was an iron parts box that Ken Iman had used for storing 13 bottles of prized Scotch whiskey, which he had accumulated over time while flying out of Harvey Point. Sad but true. A final note to the story. Lieutenant Iman later received a medal for his heroism during this catastrophe. The incident proved to be another example that open sea landings are always extremely hazardous, and each one became a learning experience. I personally have always had tremendous respect for the VH squadrons, the Dumbos, whose primary mission was an air-sea rescue. Many of our crews also made some hazardous open-sea landings. Even landings and takeoffs at some of our operating bases, namely Castle Passage and Caramaretta, were learning experiences. Landing one of these big planes in a rough sea required unusual skill, and then having to make a takeoff, even more skill. Typhoon. Even with the difficult operating conditions at Castle Passage, patrols went out as scheduled every day. This was soon to change as the elements would take over. November 6, 7, and 8 saw a vicious typhoon come through the area. After the typhoon was predicted, pilots and crews manned their planes on the evening of the 6th under orders to evacuate to Manus Island at dawn the next day. Situated just northeast of New Guinea, about 1,200 miles from Palau, Manus Island was a major Pacific Fleet repair station and out of the path of the impending storm. At dawn, however, the sea conditions and visibility precluded any takeoff attempts. At one point, there was a brief break in the storm, and 2 other squadrons arranged to get off. Their takeoff runs were breathtaking and extremely hazardous. 15 planes made it. Several, however, suffered serious damage, including losing wingtip floats. Finally, after another plane attempted to take off, lost a float, and subsequently sank, it was decided there would be no more takeoff attempts. We would ride out the storm. After having been delayed at Kwajalein for the extensive repairs to our plane that included new fuel tanks, we and Crew 14 finally left on the 3rd of November. We headed for Eniwetok, spent one night at Perry Island, and then flew on to Saipan. At Saipan, I spent the night on buoy watch, and we watched our first air raid. The Japanese regularly sent planes down from Iwo Jima to bomb the new B-29 airfields on the island. We left for Palau the next day, the 6th, and I remember late in the afternoon flying through some really bad weather. Little did we know that it was the front of a typhoon that would do us in within the next 36 hours. When we arrived and tied up to a buoy, I remained on board with Joe Durda, Walt Melmar, Harry Gardner, John Looney, Bob Garrison, and Dick Sykowski. The water was so rough the next day, it was decided we would stay on the plane rather than try to make it to the Chandeleur. At about dusk, the full force of the storm hit, and thus began a nightmarish struggle against the elements. In order to maintain some level of control, in order to steer, we kept the engines running. But 8 of our planes were torn loose from their buoys. Incredibly, they taxied back and forth safely for many hours into the next day. This was under absolutely abysmal conditions: high winds, raging seas, driving rain, and zero visibility in a harbor full of ships. Talk about sailor aviators. Unfortunately, 2 planes, Victor 4 manned by Crew 12 and ours, Victor 14, were in deep trouble. Victor 4 with Phil Unhuck's crew was swamped and sinking at its buoy. Unhuck received permission to abandon ship, and the crew took to their life rafts. They were driven rapidly across the harbor by the wind and waves. Fortunately, a PT boat, number 377, skippered by a Lieutenant J.J. Campbell, came alongside to rescue them in the now raging waters. Unhooked somehow remained in the water while assisting the 6 members of his crew to scramble aboard the PT boat. As the last crew member made it on board, Phil was dashed against and under the PT boat and last was seen floating off, obviously unconscious, into the darkness. A search was attempted, but the conditions made it almost impossible to accomplish much that night. The following day, several of the PT boats searched throughout the area but were unsuccessful, and it was concluded that Phil Unhock had perished in the huge waves. Our skipper, Ned Dougherty, later said Unhock's devotion to duty and his utter disregard for his own welfare was indicative of his entire naval career. Another hero. Back to us. We were in a desperate situation. Now unable to start our engines. Our prognosis was faulty fuel tanks, which had somehow passed inspection and been installed just a few days before at Kwajalein. We could hardly believe they could be faulty. We had flown 3 days to get to Castle Passage without any indication of trouble. There were a few choice words exchanged between us referencing the repair work performed. As the wind and waves picked up, we began dragging our buoy and the anchor that we had deployed, and finally we were torn from both and began to be driven across the raging waters of the passage. We were battling 20 to 25-foot waves at times, and winds were gusting to 80 or 90 miles an hour. A tornado sounds like a freight train and is funnel-shaped, so it's fairly local. A typhoon, on the other hand, is a horizontal storm and covers miles and miles in area. It howls unforgettably. We were fighting a losing battle, trying to bail out water. The bilge pump was inadequate. It was quite obvious we were not going to survive under these conditions, but help was impossible. It was ludicrous, anyhow, to expect the tenders to do anything under the existing conditions. We were being toyed with as the waves were controlling our every move and direction. Suddenly, out of the darkness, a large ship loomed up right in our path. With no control of the plane, we couldn't avoid colliding. We hit with tremendous force, almost tearing the starboard wing off. On the next impact, the tail section was practically torn from the fuselage, and the plane began sinking rapidly. We continued smashing against the ship, and Joe Dirda gave an order to abandon ship. Several of us tried to deploy life rafts, but the first 2 were torn away by the raging sea. Finally, our one remaining raft held, and we began to pile in. Suddenly, someone said, "Where's Sykowski?" "He still must be up in the bow," I said. "I'll go get him." I struggled through the sinking plane in waist-high water and yelled to Sykowski, "We have to get the hell out of here fast. The plane's going down." We all finally made it into the raft, and at that instant, the fuselage of the plane, riding up on a huge wave, rose above us like a huge whale. We all vacated the raft as it came crashing down. Once in the water, I pulled the toggles on my life jacket, and nothing happened. Someone, it's good I don't know who, had removed the CO2 cartridges. I did remember from survival training to get rid of my shoes, which I did, but later I regretted it. Fortunately, a couple of the guys had held onto lines attached to the raft and struggled back aboard. I never could swim or handle being in the water and was resigned to the fact that I would drown. But luck was with me. I had tangled my arm in one of the lines from the raft, and John Looney pulled me out of the deep. Then the shocker. We counted noses, and Walt Melmar was missing. We assumed he had drowned. The raft now began a toboggan-like ride across the harbor from wave to wave. After some period of time, a PT boat appeared out of nowhere, somehow came alongside, and began to help us aboard. I distinctly remember trying to reach the small railing around the deck of the PT, and it would suddenly rise about 15 feet above me. Suddenly I got hold of it, held on for dear life, and a couple of the PT crew grabbed one of my hands and pulled me up onto the deck. They got me below, and I recall for a while being violently seasick with my head stuck in a bucket. I finally dozed off in the violently pitching 90-foot boat. At some point late in the night, I woke from my fitful sleep to hear a terrible grinding noise under the hull. I inquired of one of the crew, and he said, "We've run into the anti-submarine nets that are at one end of the passage. They're beating the hell out of our hull." I recall being very calm and thinking, "Que sera, sera." I guess I had resigned myself to the fact that we were finished, but suddenly we broke free from the nets. We somehow did survive the night, and when the storm abated the next day, we were returned to the Chandeleur in exchange for several gallons of ice cream. The standard reward for rescuing airmen was a gallon per. We did get some good news. Walter Milmar was safe. He had exited the sinking plane through his cockpit window, grabbed a line hanging from the ship we collided with, and the crew had pulled him aboard. We were welcomed back on board by a large crowd on deck, as it had been presumed we were dead. After a short debriefing and medical questions, I remember being asked, "How are your nerves?" I obviously responded that I was a little shaky, knowing full well that small bottles of medical whiskey were available for calming down. It took 2. Several humorous events that I remember about this typhoon. In the late afternoon, just before we arrived at Castle Passage, before the storm broke in its full fury, we unfortunately broke loose from our buoy, and the Chandeleur sent a large whaleboat to tow us back to it. Sykowski was managing the bow, and the coxswain of the boat threw Dick a line and began yelling, "Heave it in." Joe Dirter leaned out of the cockpit and yelled at Dick, "Heave it in." With both the coxswain and Dirter yelling, "Heave it in," Dick picked up all the line he had, pulled it in, and heaved it into the ocean. It was obvious we should have taught Dick some of the basic seamanship semantics. Because we had just come from Kwajalein, all of our personal belongings were with us on the plane. As we had the buoy watch right after we arrived, we never had a chance to put anything on the tender, so we lost all of our worldly possessions. It was hilarious trying to convince the supply officer that I had lost everything, including my watch. He was convinced I was lying to get free clothes, a new watch, and everything else we were entitled to as survivors. We got the clothes pretty easily, but getting compensated for the watch took forever. For me, it was even more of a disaster. I wore size 14 shoes and had gotten the 2 sets I owned by virtue of a kind officer when I was in boot camp. Navy small stores did not stock 14s as a regular item, and now both pairs of mine were in the deep. I wore shower clogs for 2 days once back aboard the tender, and then a pair of size 14 marine issue boondockers were requisitioned, and I wore those until I found some regular Navy shoes on Saipan. Another typhoon story related to Crew 6. Unfortunately, while they were gassing up before the full magnitude of the storm struck, a whaleboat that had broken loose from one of the ships in the harbor hit the plane and tore the bow door off. As the evening progressed, they broke the cable to their buoy and then were really on their own, taxiing into the swells, which were monstrous and breaking up over the plane. They had set up a bucket brigade to move water from the bow through the plane into one of the rear hatches where it could be dumped into the sea. In the early hours of the morning, Joe Pugh's voice came over the intercom. "I'm losing control and can't keep the plane heading into the swells. I don't think I can get her back, so prepare to abandon ship." Chad Alger, looking at the raging sea, said to himself, "What's the use of going out there? I might as well stay here." Fortunately, in the next moment or so, Pugh skillfully got the plane back under control and again was riding the swells, so Alger never had to make that difficult decision. The crew all said later, "Joe earned our undying gratitude for magnificent seamanship that horrible night." Another example of a sailor aviator. Looking back, it was incredible that the number of planes and personnel survived that did. Phil Enhock was the only personnel casualty, but we still had 12, albeit waterlogged planes. The following is a report on our experience published in Naval Aviation News. You've seen cartoons in which fog or other weather conditions have been reported so bad that airmen claimed they saw fish floating by their windows. But one Navy Mariner squadron claims it actually happened. It seems the squadron was riding out a typhoon for 14 hours, during which time the winds lifted the planes off the water, and at other times partially submerged them with 20-foot waves. The pilots kept the engines running continuously. When waves broke over the top of the fuselage, at intervals, crewmen claimed they saw strange fish swirling by the portholes. It was like flying the plane while it was tethered down. Ann Landers, the syndicated columnist, got into the Typhoon Act in a column printed in 1993. From a sampling of letters she received in response to a letter in her column about the size of waves in a Pacific typhoon, she reported 3 irrefutable facts. 1, Elvis is dead. 2, the Pope is Catholic. 3, in a Pacific typhoon with winds over 70 miles an hour and massive swells, waves can and do come over the top of the bow of an aircraft carrier. In a recommendation to the Commander 3rd Fleet, as a result of the typhoon, Skipper Ned Dougherty wrote, "On the evening of 7 November, Coastal Passage was swept by the full force of a tropical typhoon with winds in excess of 72 knots. Waves estimated as high as 15 to 25 feet, and visibility reduced to zero in the squalls which lashed the area. For about 48 hours, these officers and men, with magnificent display of courage and initiative, fought the elements, seasick and weary to a man, working in bucket brigades to keep the aircraft afloat. No one will ever know all of the courageous acts and extraordinary efforts put forth by the officers and men of the crews who managed to bring so many planes through the catastrophic storm safely, as well as the 2 crews who lost their planes. It is therefore recommended that below-named officers and men be awarded the Commendation Ribbon for courage and devotion to duty, as displayed when under conditions of great personal danger to their own lives, as outlined in paragraph 2. This outstanding courage, stamina, and devotion to duty in saving PBM-3D aircraft and preventing loss of life and damage to other aircraft and surface craft in Coastal Passage gives evidence of their extremely high value to United Naval Service. Back to normal. After the storm had passed, it was obvious that all the surviving aircraft suffered some degree of damage. Engines and electrical equipment had been thoroughly water-soaked, and a majority of the bombing systems were inoperative. Bilges were full, some wingtip floats and tail empennages had been damaged, but despite the loss of the 2 planes in the storm and of 1 off the Philippines, and despite all the damage done to the remaining 12 at Coastal Passage, regular patrols resumed within 48 hours. This was a real tribute to the crews in the Chandeleurs Patsu. In November, the squadron increased its number of daily patrols to 4 and then to 5 on alternating days. This was in addition to Dumbo standby and other special coverages, as requested. Repairs were done regularly on one plane or another to keep the squadron functioning. Bringing one of the big seaplanes aboard the Chandeleur for maintenance was quite a task. The plane was lightened by dumping fuel, removing ordnance, and any other movable heavy equipment. Then the plane would be towed alongside the tender, where the cables from the electric hydraulic crane on the seaplane deck could be attached to the tie-down points on the top of the plane's fuselage. Then it was hoisted up to the deck, the beaching gear was attached, and the plane was set down and secured on the deck diagonally because the plane was 79 feet long with a 118-foot wingspan, and the seaplane deck area was only 72 feet wide. The undependable Curtiss-Wright engines continued to plague us. On the 20th, Crew 11, while returning from patrol, still about 120 miles from base, had their starboard engine begin to vibrate so badly it had to be shut down. Jettisoning everything possible, they made it back to a safe, if somewhat precarious, landing in the storm-driven rough waters of the passage. Another perspective on the unloved Curtiss-Wright engine was provided by a pilot from a sister squadron, VP-16. These engines could swallow valves like a monkey swallows peanuts. Most of us agreed. The real danger was that when an engine swallowed a valve, it could blow the head off the crankcase of the engine and throw metal like shrapnel. We had received a placement plane for Charlotte the Harlot, now at the bottom of the ocean. We had test flown it several times and completed 2 patrols in it. However, on the 22nd, while on the Philippines patrol about 400 miles from base, on the way home, we lost all manifold pressure on the port engine. I was standing watch as flight engineer, and immediately I feathered the engine. We were now veterans of jettisoning procedures and rapidly had lightened the plane. We made it back to base again. Leo Early's low-key comment immediately upon landing was, "Well, guys, just another bit sweat job. Tomorrow you can go to work putting the plane back together." More rough water. As I've mentioned, takeoffs are often a real challenge. One particularly dismal, stormy day, we got up early and took a wet and rough ride in the whaleboat out to the plane and prepared for our takeoff. We cranked up the engines and started our takeoff run through the large swells, following the contours of the water surface. We were bounced into the air on top of one swell, but without enough airspeed to stay airborne. So we went over into the trough and up on the next swell. We gained a little more airspeed, but still not enough. But after 2 more bounces off the top of the swells, we were finally airborne. I remember holding on for dear life, but we made it because we had 2 good sailor aviators in the cockpit. This was not really an unusual occurrence, as can be attested to by most any seaplane crew. Takeoffs like that were very aptly described by a pilot in VPB 208 after one of his takeoffs. His plane went from swell to trough, sometimes disappearing below the level of the sea, then bouncing from wave to wave. He said a takeoff like that is a bit like running a light tank through a series of concrete barriers. Real sea legs. Most of us never thought we'd really be sailors, but we became such in spite of ourselves. We were constantly on the water. Our routine had a certain monotony about it, going from the tender to the plane and back to the tender. For example, if someone had the buoy watch on Monday morning, he was relieved about noon and returned to the ship for lunch in the afternoon. Then he came back to the plane after early dinner for the night watch. Tuesday morning, back to the tender, and after early lunch, back to the plane for the afternoon watch. Then back to the ship for dinner, maybe a movie and a night's sleep on board. Then Wednesday, he predictably flew. Since a good deal of time was spent on the plane, in all kinds of weather and sea conditions, we had no choice but to get our sea legs. We used to kid Joe Dirter, our first pilot, and later our PPC, because he'd usually get seasick on buoy watch. Our two ensigns, Walt and Paul, usually covered the buoy watches so that Joe could stay on board the ship. Transport between the ship and the plane was usually by whaleboat, a small dory-shaped boat about 20 feet long, manned by a coxswain who was in charge and an engine man. It seated about 10 to 12 people. Sometimes we were transported by rearming barges, a bit bigger boat, but not as comfortable or as easy to handle around the planes. The coxswain seemed to take great delight in soaking us in as much spray as possible on our way to or from the plane. The fact that we spent so much time on our planes made for an even closer camaraderie. It created a special kind of bonding with the crew. Samuel Stauffer, in his book, The American Soldier, made a good point about the fact that what was important was the loyalty that developed among individual soldiers in small units. Stauffer emphasized that this loyalty was far more important than flag and country. That loyalty may be far more important than anything in overcoming the daily challenge of the military. I believe this fact was true with seaplane crews who spent so much time in the confines of the plane, both flying and when in a boat on the water. I mentioned before that as Airedales we were often the target of derision by shipboard sailors, the black shoes, who would complain about having to roll out of the sack at 3:15 to go on watch, while those Airedales sleep in and goof off for a day or two, or when they aren't flying. They were so obviously jealous of our flight pay. I said to the coxswain who was splashing us on the way out to our plane one day, "Why don't you take my place today and then you might get some flight pay?" His reply was something unprintable. He closed the conversation saying, "Furthermore, there's no way I'd go up in one of those damn things." I then ended the conversation by telling him, "You should spend half your time with us on buoy watch, and then you'll know what a real sailor is." With all due deference to the coxswain, it did take a certain skill to come alongside a plane at the buoy in rough weather. Often there would be a miscue, and the hulls of most planes had patches and dents near the waist hatch. The trick was timing, particularly for us when entering or exiting the plane. We had to coordinate our moves with the up and down movement of the boat and the plane, or we could really get hurt. Fueling the plane at the buoy from a gas bowser, a floating tanker truck, was also difficult. In rough weather, it required some real seamanship skills to stay alongside a plane for the time needed to pump in hundreds of gallons of aviation gas via hoses attached through the port beaching gear hatch to fuel tank connections in the plane. When it was really rough and the danger of damage to the plane was high, the gas bowser would make a buoy and fuel us from there. This procedure was a little more complicated, but safer. One fine day, one of our crews was getting ready to depart the Chandeleur for their plane and had boarded the whaleboat just as a huge wave swamped it. The crew began scrambling off and came back onto the Chandeleur's gangplank when the coxswain began yelling, "Don't get off, it won't sink." In the next moment, he suddenly realized he was down waist deep in the water. He finally conceded and grabbed the gangplank as the whaleboat sank from sight. Like the airlines say, the most dangerous part of your trip is the drive to the airport. I always felt that boarding the plane from the ship was one of the most dangerous parts of our patrol. A typical week of 168 hours while operating from a tender would be about 98 hours on the plane, 30 plus hours flying, and the rest on buoy watch, and the remaining 70 hours on the ship. The plane was our second home and had a few comforts. On buoy watch, there were always housekeeping chores to be done. Pumping bilges was a constant, inasmuch as the hulls took a beating in the constantly rough water. Then there was cleaning the decking, which always seemed to have a film of oil on it. Oiling the propellers to prevent corrosion, which is always a problem with the salt water, which also played havoc with the engines. Cleaning machine guns and turrets, and other general maintenance. Some of us even waxed the leading edge of the wings to try to gain a couple more knots of airspeed. A story we heard many times was that the Japanese were always wary of PBMs because of our armament, the 850 caliber machine guns supplemented by the 230 calibers. We bolstered that story by painting vertical black stripes about a foot long below each of the fuel jettison pipes, which were just below the tail turret, so that it would appear there were two other guns. Confusing signals. More confusion about submarine attack protocol resulted in some disciplinary action. One of the crews was returning from an anti-sub flight when the bow turret lookout reported a submarine running on the surface. The pilot immediately turned and began a run on it, and the sub began to submerge when the co-pilot yelled, "We could be in a submarine sanctuary," a designated safe area for U.S. subs. The radioman had already sent a coded message to base indicating the sighting when the pilot decided to abort the attack. This was during a time period when we had been instructed never to break radio silence. The end result was the pilot was disciplined by having to fly his first pilot for several weeks before being restored to patrol plane commander. No word was ever received about the identity of the sub in question. The continuing confusion over sub sightings, sanctuary zones, and the communication was upon us for the rest of our tour of the Pacific, as will be attested to by further incidents recorded herein. Crew 14 changes. We had the first changes of personnel in our crew since Vince Volpe had transferred to the ground crew in October. Now Leo Early and Paul Casey left the crew, and a new pilot joined us, Ensign Lee Orsak. Fred Reddy, aviation ordnanceman, was transferred to another crew. Bill Davis, aviation ordnanceman, and John Shellock, aviation radioman, joined us and stayed with Crew 14 until we returned home in mid-April 45. We would now fly with just the three pilots, Durda, Melmeyer, and Orsak. Torpedoed. While watching a movie one night on the Chandelure, one of our planes returning from patrol and coming in for a landing accidentally dropped a depth charge, which exploded not far from the ship. The obvious reaction on board was, "My God, we've been torpedoed." Fortunately, the only damage caused was an interruption of the movie. Oh, the insanity of war. The skipper of the Chandelure, Captain Goodney, was a stickler for the Navy's no alcohol regulation. But our skipper, Ned Dougherty, who was known to enjoy one now and then, convinced the captain that it was okay to anchor a float off the starboard beam of the ship, where it would be legal to sip a few. The ship's crew made a small but stable pontoon barge and made available a whaleboat, deferred the guys to the barge for some R&R. Now, once a week, a crew would go out in the barge and get 2 bottles of warm 3.2 beer. It worked quite well, and morale improved dramatically. Thanksgiving Day 1944 was much the same as any day at Castle Passage, except there was a relatively smooth sea. Art Kennedy, a pilot in Crew 16, remembered the day as a nice one, but a bit scary for the crew that had R&R privileges. Art's crew was not flying this day, and he was relaxing on deck. The R&R crew had left the ship as scheduled, and were enjoying themselves sitting around in the sun with a few brews. No one swam at Castle Passage because there were schools of barracuda in the waters. Art was standing by the starboard rail with Bob Watts, another pilot, watching the revelers, and they were also watching some Marine fighter planes. In an almost perfect traffic pattern, they were dropping napalm on some Japanese positions on Babalthuap Island, just across the passage. This was almost a daily activity for the Marines. Suddenly, the ship's public announcement blared out that an air raid was imminent and that the ship would be getting underway for protection. In the confusion, no visible effort was made to retrieve the R&R group. As the ship got underway, another announcement: enemy plane in the area. Art and Bob, hardly aware that the ship had been underway for 3 or 4 minutes, suddenly spotted a single Japanese twin-engine land plane coming straight down the anchorage. It was obvious his target would probably be a floating dry dock anchored in the passage. He made his run and dropped 2 bombs. One went into the water and the other bullseyed onto the dry dock. It caused minimal damage as the main deck was covered with heavy timbers used for shoring up a ship when in for repairs. Then the plane headed off to the southwest and disappeared. At that, Bob turned to Art and said, "Oh, the insanity of war. That Japanese pilot probably flew 600 miles from the Philippines in a land-based plane to drop 2 ineffectual bombs. We're watching a bunch of Marine fighter planes forming a traffic pattern like over an airstrip, dropping napalm on the Japanese, and a group of guys trying to enjoy a little R&R end up being scared half to death." Later that evening, Doug Thompson, our ACI officer, listened to Tokyo Rose and told Art later that she had announced that one of their planes had raided the U.S. fleet at Castle Passage and sunk an aircraft carrier. Art's comment was that poor Japanese pilot had slim pickings but a vivid imagination. Actually, it turned out that the ships in the harbor had been alerted that a Japanese carrier task force was headed towards Palau, so the 70 or so ships in the passage had gotten underway. Despite the confusion, everyone on the Chandelure did get a nice Thanksgiving dinner with all the trimmings while the ship was underway. I never heard the rest of the story about where the R&R group spent the day. Hopefully there was a supply of 3-2 on the barge to keep them content. We were flying that day, so we missed all the action and also the Thanksgiving dinner of turkey and all the fixings. This particular incident reminded me how inane war really is, how many bad decisions get made. I'm not a military tactician, and I realize it's awfully difficult for the military to plan with any surety because war has no hard and fast rules. What usually occurs happens on the spur of the moment, and once logic is suspended, emotion takes over. The remainder of the month was relatively quiet, with all patrols off on schedule, and the weather was surprisingly good for the choppy waters of Castle Passage. Visit to the Philippines. On December 6th, Crew 3, with Charles Atkinson piloting, was flying the Philippines patrol and was about to turn for home when they were forced to go on single engine. In view of the relative distances and unfavorable headwinds predicted on the planned return route, Atkinson decided to head for the island of Leyte, where they landed in the early afternoon. They were ordered aboard a tender in the harbor while their plane was repaired. The unplanned stopover was to be an interesting experience for all of the crew. They got to go ashore, and once there they began swapping cigarettes, coffee, and whatever for bolo knives, baskets, and other native products. Bartering with the natives was an art, and Deke Slayman, one of the pilots, said, "One must have the proper sense of determination and also a flair for properly interpreting broken English." John Lingle possessed both the sense and the flair as described by one of his shipmates. The pattern ran something like this, with characteristic pedagogic pantomime, of course. "I give you 10 these, you give me 20 those." Lingle was successful, as evidenced by the souvenirs Crew 3 returned with. Bob Wolf, another of the pilots, failing to show the old Navy shore leave spirit, displeased one of the locals by asking where to get a drink of good water. The astonished local launched into a diatribe. "You dumb American who doesn't want to drink whiskey, dance, sing, or go out with a girl, but want nothing more than a drink of water?" Several of the crew also heard that something called pom-pom was available from the natives in exchange for a blanket, but no one had a blanket. It was probably just as well. It probably saved them from visits to sick bay. Ensign Bolding and machinist mate Horst Wiegand were on their way back to the tender in the harbor at Leyte the next day when several Japanese planes began a dive-bombing attack. Wiegand later said the only thing worse than being in a whaleboat during a dive-bombing attack would be missing a buoy for the 8th straight time and hearing it from your PPC. Later aboard ship, Wiegand, using his commanding persuasive skills, impressed one of the commissary stewards with a few words about his outstanding devotion to his work and what tremendous skills it must take to feed so many fighting men so much good food. These words of praise were enough to wangle 15 steaks from the steward for a late dinner for the crew. The dinner almost made the trip a success. 3 days later, the crew was on their way back to Castle Passage with some interesting memories and a variety of stories to tell their grandchildren. Another typhoon story. During pre-flight briefing on December 17th, Rex Rader and Crew 11 were informed they might come across a squall line when they were out on the return leg of their patrol, and that it might well turn into a typhoon. As Rex recalled, "I didn't remember anything significant on the way out to the end of our patrol sector, but as noted, we did encounter an area of stormy weather on the way back. I was pretty sure in my own mind that we had found the front of a typhoon. Rex had also been made aware that Bull Halsey's Third Fleet was in the patrol area and realized that an accurate weather report would be important to him. Rex didn't send a weather report from the plane suggesting a typhoon, as he'd been told that reports were supposed to be sent by the Chandeleur. He made his point at debriefing that he was sure that it was indeed a typhoon, but the report that was sent to the Third Fleet, when finally decoded, erroneously reported a squall line. The problem that developed over the bad communication was that the Third Fleet needed to be refueled, and unfortunately they chose a refueling spot right in the path of the storm, actually just about where Crew 11 had positioned the storm. As a result of the confusion, when the typhoon hit the Third Fleet, 2 ships capsized and 500 men were lost. It was felt that Halsey would definitely have changed his plans if the word typhoon had been used in the report to the Third Fleet. The following day, another disaster. Crew 11 was assigned to search for the survivors of the capsized ships, but shortly after takeoff, their radar became inoperable and they were ordered to return to base. They returned and circled, meanwhile jettisoning most of their fuel, standard preparation for a power stall landing, which was tried in certain sea conditions. Rex then made a perfect power stall approach, and after the touching down, headed for the buoy. Then tragedy struck. As the crew looked on, a plane from another squadron cracked open like an egg just after the wing. They had made a bad power stall approach. It was later learned that they had also failed to jettison their surplus fuel. A tough lesson, but wise pilots know an overloaded plane won't respond well to a power stall landing approach. Later, when we were based at Ulithi, Rex was assigned as boat officer on the day that Admiral Nimitz flew in for a meeting with Admiral Halsey. Rex had arranged to transport Nimitz from his seaplane to the meeting. The water was quite rough that day, and Rex used a small personnel boat to approach Nimitz's PB-2Y, feeling that he would be safer than the Admiral's rather bulky barge. As luck would have it, a wave splashed over the boat just as Nimitz boarded. Rex suggested that perhaps Nimitz would prefer to transfer to an Admiral's barge that was standing by, as it would be more comfortable in the rough sea. Nimitz replied something like this: "Son, I'm running this goddamn Navy, and will stay in this boat." So they putt-putted across the harbor where Halsey's flagship, the battleship New Jersey, was anchored. Rex said later that he had been tempted to say something about the weather reporting incident while with Nimitz, but felt discretion was still the better part of valor. Actually, Rex later learned that Nimitz had come to conduct an inquiry into Halsey's action during the typhoon. Rex's final comment on this whole typhoon situation related to a book that Halsey later wrote about the storm. When I first read it, I was very upset. All I could think of was what Crew 11 went into at great risk for naught, and that several ships and 500 men were lost because one message, our message, was not encoded properly. Upon reflection, however, I concluded that we did, in the final analysis, have real impact on weather reporting in the Pacific for the rest of the war. What he meant by that was the incident did result in procedural changes in weather reporting. A visit from the Martin Company. In Mariner, Marlin, Anywhere, Anytime, it says that Ken Ebel, a Glenn L. Martin Company vice president and test pilot, made a 5-week tour of the Central Pacific in the fall of '44. Ebel described his trip this way: "I was invited by the Navy to see our planes at work, mostly at their seadromes. I saw plenty of them at every base." He was referring to Guam, Eniwetok, Kwajalein, Saipan, Ulithi, and the most forward-based Castle Passage in the Palau Group. The men who fly and service PBMs are enthusiastic about the ship. They have made many open sea landings and continue to fly in foul weather in order to complete their scheduled missions. What a hull, you often hear. I observed several minor and 1 or 2 major changes that should greatly improve its performance. These comments by Ebel were well-founded. Operating an airplane from the water imposed a lot of penalties. To cope with the beating from waves on takeoffs and landings, flying boats had to be built stronger and heavier than comparable land planes. Internal equipment and instruments took a pounding that often shortened their lifespans. The corrosive salt water ate away at metal propeller blades and engine parts, reducing their service life compared to those of a land plane. In spite of the drawbacks such as these, the seaplane was an essential part of the Navy's air arm. The PBM was a masterpiece of a flying boat. As we often said, we may have had a love-hate relationship with them, but in the final analysis, we were all often amazed at how well they stood under the conditions which we operated. Clothing. Individual clothing was quite varied. and a lot was not in conformance with Navy regs, often very non-GI. The only really hard and fast rule for air crews was no shorts or short-sleeve shirts when flying because of the ever-present danger of severe sunburn if we went down at sea. Several of our crews learned this lesson the hard way. Some of us wore regulation flight suits, some wore the CB green dungarees. However, most enlisted men wore navy blue dungarees and the officers their standard khaki or CB greens. Shoes other than regulation black for enlisted men and brown for officers were marine boondockers with occasional flight boots. Headgear ranged from regulation white hats dyed blue for enlisted men, baseball caps, Frank Buck tropical helmets, and a smattering of miscellaneous railroad engineers' hats and purloined Japanese Army caps. Enlisted personnel had free laundry service aboard ship. A simple procedure. You put your dirty clothes in with dozens of other people's in a huge bag, which was run through a large washing machine and dryer. When the clothes were done, they were dumped in a pile on the deck, and you sorted through and picked yours out, identifying them by your name stenciled or painted on each garment. Bob Garrison, our closet kleptomaniac, often had pairs of dungarees with various names other than Garrison printed on them. Never quite figured out how he got away with it. Mail call. I mentioned earlier that all of our mail was being censored. In retrospect, I'm not sure how critical it was. Like a lot of other things done during war days, however, censoring was done largely for its impact to keep us all focused on the seriousness of the war. I don't believe we really needed to be reminded. The fact was that all the Japanese or Germans needed to know they could have garnered from U.S. radio broadcasts or by reading U.S. newspapers. Newspapers are a great source of all types of information for all of the warring countries. A method called content analysis was developed into a fine science. It was a technique of analyzing and preparing an accurate analysis of the particular country's newspapers, which generally provided a good insight into the war's impact on things like people's food, transportation, and industrial output. For example, most papers listed the persons killed or wounded, which was obviously critical information. In Europe, my brothers told me there were all kinds of stories about data gathering. One of the best was the French underground checking local laundries regularly to see where the occupying German soldiers might be forwarding their clothes, new duty stations. There are also all kinds of rules and regulations about keeping diaries and taking pictures. Both were forbidden, but obviously circumvented by many people, as evidenced by the hundreds of photos I have accumulated in my role of VPB 21 Association Coordinator. An ingenious Jim Guay of Crew 7 rigged up a gun camera for hand operation and filmed many scenes, including the U.S. fleet heading for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He had films of various other actions by the Squadron 2, but when he arrived back in the States, a custom officer checking Jim's belongings found the film and confiscated it. The officer assigned to censorship duties knew more about each of us than anyone. He knew whose love life was doing well, who had marital problems, who family members were. I came across a letter a few years ago that I'd written from Castle Passage to my parents. As I recall, I tried to tell them that we'd had a couple of tough months and had lost our plane, but the letter that follows is what got through the system. A mail call story. About 2 weeks before Christmas, Steve Tritask of Crew 15 received a package from one of his many girlfriends. The package weighed about 5 pounds, and Steve was sure it held shrimp, caviar, and possibly a bottle of wine. He was relieving Frosty Moore that day on buoy watch, and when he got to the plane, he asked Frosty to hang around a few minutes to share some of the goodies. He opened the package, and in it was a 5-pound can of Spam. He walked to the waste hatch and ceremoniously dropped the can in the drink and said, "That's one gal I can mark off my list." I remember my Christmas package from home. It even arrived early. It had one of my all-time favorites in it, canned raspberries, and about 6 packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes. Our C-store cigarettes, which were a bargain at a nickel a pack, were almost always stale old Chesterfields, so the Luckies were worth their weight in gold. Next stop, Ulithi. In late December, we began to move to our next duty station, Ulithi Atoll, also part of the Caroline Island chain, northeast of Palau. Taken by U.S. forces a few months before during a battle on September 20th and September 21st, Ulithi was being developed into a major advanced fleet base. We flew at Ulithi with crews 4 and 7 in a 3-plane section, arriving about noontime on December 23rd. I don't think any of us were sorry to leave Coastal Passage. The operation conditions had been so difficult. We lost 3 planes in 8 weeks. One last comment about Palau. A number of months ago, I read in the travel section of USA Today that the Palaus are one of the world's top snorkeling and diving spots and have fantastic beaches with beautiful white sand and are mostly deserted, a real paradise. My lasting impressions prompt me to say I'll take a rain check on a trip back there.